One thing I've noticed a lot in gaming is the high amount of disappointments. Pokemon Black and White were my disappointments. I've been disappointed many times by games. I've been disappointed by BioShock Infinite. I was disappointed by Halo Reach. I was disappointed by so much stuff. But the biggest disappointment for me, Pokemon Black and White. Good lord. Those games sucked. They weren't even that good, but the worst part about them was the hype. So let me break down why Pokemon Black and White were major disappointments and helped steer the franchise in a bad direction. So, the first thing that was bad about Generation 5, the designs. This was the one many people started making fun of. Why? Because they just weren't that great. Many people who hadn't been into Pokemon just looked at them and were like, what the fuck is this shit? While many people who had been fans for years and years either were like, meh, or the hardcore ones were like, this is gonna be awesome. In a few years, you're gonna like think this is cool. The problem with these designs were, they were forgettable. Other than Tisutaja or Snivy or I forget the names because honestly most of these Pokemon are forgettable. Most of these Pokemon fell into obscurity, except for the ones heavily marketed by Nintendo like the starters. You had all sorts of Pokemon, such as the 2 gears taped together. People were just saying, oh, Generation 1 did it, but the problem is, you would think they would have moved on from Generation 1 instead of going back to reusing the same concepts, which were forgettable. You had generic bird Pokemon, that one forgettable volcano whatever Pokemon, some electric zebra, and 400 other throwaway designs. These are just some of the designs used in XY, and unless you're one of those people who memorizes them all, they're forgettable. Diamond and Pearl, you remember half the Pokemon from there. Johto, Hoenn, you probably remember half the Pokemon from there. Black and White, forgettable, other than the heavily marketed Pokemon that they made lots of merchandising off of. Seriously, the Pokemon in this generation just sucked. But when I first played the generation, the Pokemon designs were the least of the problems I had with it. The main problems were the unfulfilled promises, and of course, all the disappointment. Let's start off with the other problem first off, the Dream World. Dream World was just as forgettable as the plasma for Wi-Fi from Platinum. It was confusing, the mini-games were terrible too, and of course, you get kicked out after a certain period of time on both. You see, the Dream World / Pokemon Global Link or whatever was loaded with issues. Especially when the game first came out. If you think, say, Call of Duty's server launch is disastrous, or for many other online games, Pokemon Global Link was a total nightmare. Just for one country alone, the servers went down all the time. It would be down for maintenance half the time. When the game first came out, like right after it came out when I got the game, by the time I actually got the game because of the slow shipping, the servers were down. That's right, this Dream World has the most unstable servers ever. And when you got in, you'd find just generic mini games. It was a big disappointment. You'd hear all this stuff about being able to do Pokemon stuff on your PC. You get there, all you find out is that there's nothing. Just mini-games, and some berry growing. Did I mention features were removed from Black and White from Diamond and Pearl just to tack this on? Berry growing was gone. You had to do it online. That's right. The berry growing in this game wasn't like in normal. You couldn't just plant berries, run off, come back, get them. In this game, you'd have to plant them online. Now, of course, considering everybody seems to make a big deal now about how you can't do stuff when the servers are down, this was a big thing because the servers were always down. The servers went down for every little thing, from being overloaded to the big Japan tsunami, which knocked a ton of stuff out. I mean, seriously, the servers were down all the time. And to make matters worse, another design decision was to keep older generations out. In an attempt to make the game feel fresher that backfired, there were no old Pokemon until you beat the game. Throughout the whole game, all the Pokemon were the new Pokemon. So unlike in Diamond and Pearl, where you still had some Generation 1 through 3 Pokemon in the game, this game, in an attempt to be new, had only these new Pokemon. And let me tell you, many people who weren't hardcore fans weren't pleased. The only way to get them without beating the game? Do the Dream World. But now for another thing I thought I'd show you, I'd like to tell you about the 3DS 2. You see, one mistake this game made was not waiting. Nintendo screwed up big time with the 3DS launch, and this game didn't help. Now, in a failed attempt at change, Pokemon Black and White had two different cities in each version, Black City and White Forest. Here's the thing, you had to beat the game in a certain amount of time, or the city would be empty. Why, of course? To shoehorn in a feature nobody used. The Sea Gear. And the Sea Gear pretty much sucked. It was pretty much a feature to find Pokemon players around you and battle them, either through infrared, like they had a ton of Heart Gold Soul Silver cartridges and wanted to tack that on somehow. Online, you could tap that and it would connect to the Dream World and upload your thing, which I forgot to mention earlier, would take forever. And wireless, which would let you find people around you and battle them quickly. Of course, this doesn't work well in the US because nobody owns Pokemon. Not many people play that game outside of little kids. And unless you frequent the playgrounds, with the risk of being caught by Chris Hansen, I doubt you'd want to do that. Perhaps the biggest disappointment? Missing the boat. Around 2010, when Black and White was still in development, and the game was pretty much, the new info was coming out, a rumor starts swirling around that Nintendo was going to use the new NVIDIA Tegra chipset for a new DS. Of course, we all know they cheaped out at the last minute because Nintendo is all about cheap and went toward a 3D gimmick because after all, 3D was the cool thing, and of course that gimmick died off because now you don't see the 3D being advertised as much in 3DS games anymore. But basically, the rumor started swirling around and reports came out that Pokemon and Nintendo had dev kits. So guess what they do? Made the same mistake as with the DS. Released the games late. Pokemon X and Y only got announced this year, while the sweet spot for releasing a Pokemon game would have been earlier. Sure, nobody owned a 3DS, but if they released a major Pokemon game on the 3DS, you would expect sales to go way up. And plus, they'd actually have an excuse for X and Y's graphics. They could have said it was an early 3DS game that was rushed, and that would have gone pretty well because the 3DS was a new system. Instead, X and Y is only coming out now, and all the features that Black and White could have been used are going to be wasted. Had Pokemon been on the 3DS, it could have helped the 3DS out of its problems much sooner. But instead, it's coming later, when the 3DS has already had a big price cut, and Nintendo is making the same mistake again with the Wii U. But now, for the last reason on why Pokemon Black and White sucked. The story. One of the good parts about the older Pokemon games was the story wasn't too forced. Sadly, this got more and more forced until we ended up with Black and White 1. What is this game, you may ask? Basically, linear, walk in a line, get shoved with a forced story, which is cringy, to win. Now, with many games, you've got good stories. Pokemon Black and White is not one of those. The story is pretty much you versus Pokemon PETA, or Team Plasma, is they're officially called, and you're basically having to take them down while also seeing some emotionally ambitious end backstory, which is so fanficky in a bad way. And that's pretty much what you did the whole game. It was just cringy, to say the least. The plot was extremely cheesy and you couldn't take it seriously, and yet this was forced throughout the whole game. Now, maybe it's because before I touched Black and White, I had played this little game called Mass Effect, which was actually fun. Same with all these other games, such as Chrono Cross and more. I had touched them before playing Black and White 1. Maybe it's because Pokemon's getting worse. But in the other hand, the other problem could be Pokemon just not wanting to change very much. Sure, you might get new features like sitting on benches, but you might also get features like walking Pokemon that follow you. Absolutely does not change the gameplay formula at all. And Pokemon, it's one of those series when you've played it to death, you literally just can't play it anymore. You can't really replay the single player once you've played it once. And did I mention they've got the third versions where the differences on Bulbapedia read more like a title update to a game series? Yeah, all in all, save your money and don't buy this game. Or any Pokemon game, especially X and Y. Pokemon's going downhill. I used to be a much bigger fan of it, and then I realized it needs a reboot badly. Thanks for watching and subscribe for more.